Much, Suzanne, and thanks for bringing it back to what we all need to do. You're going to be hearing a bit about that later, but I don't want people to leave tonight thinking, oh, that was all very interesting and I agreed with every word, and then to go back to watching Strictly. There are more urgent things. I don't say more important things, but more immediate things than Strictly, at least for the next 6 months. There is one job in this room that really does disappear if we leave the EU, and that's mine. And I think that is a trade-off that is well worth making. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to be back here. Great pleasure to be back at this university. Great pleasure to be back in this great city. And in this place where English national consciousness could be said to have been born some 1,200 years ago, just up the road in Alfred's capital of Winchester. I said that Shakespeare has something to say about everything. Of course, it was from Southampton that Henry V set sail in his great wars of conquest. The scene is now transported, gentles, to Southampton, says the narrator. It was from here that the Mayflower set sail, crewed with local sailors and carrying that sublime ideal that laws ought not to be passed nor taxes raised except by our elected representatives, people whom we can hire and fire. Seeds that went out in the Mayflower found fertile soil across the Atlantic, and a great republic now exists dedicated to the ideal of representative government. What a sad thing if we see the ancestral tree withering back in the place where those ideals were first adumbrated. And actually it was just above here on the downs, then not black and frozen with winter, but flush and rank with June, that Eisenhower gave his final address to the Allied armies at Mabley just before D-Day. Campaign that, of course, was fought for the independence of these islands, but also for the freedom of every democratic nation in Europe. We, of all people, need no lessons about being good Europeans. We, of all people, understand that genuine patriotism is founded in a respect for the freedom of all nations and an interest in the welfare of all friendly peoples. I could therefore stand here and talk to you for an hour about the things we've achieved and the things that make us what we are as a people, but I'm not going to. Because the case for leaving the European Union does not depend on nostalgia or on introversion, but on the contrary, ours is the cheerful, optimistic, internationalist, democratic, and constitutional case. The nostalgia that I hear over and over again in this debate is the nostalgia of those who cannot move on from their 1950s vision of a regional bloc. Now, we could argue about whether it ever really made sense for the United Kingdom to abandon its global markets and participate in a customs union at the western tip of the Eurasian landmass. I mean, the whole point of a market, if you think about it, the whole purpose of trade is to swap on the back of differences. The most successful market is therefore the most diverse one. I would question whether it ever made sense to abandon a global trading system which brought together a genuinely heterodox and pluralist group of economies, some agrarian, some commodity-based, some industrial, some services-based, and to replace that system with a narrow grouping of similar industrialized economies linked by geography. You could argue about whether it made sense to have regional blocs even in the 1950s. You could argue about whether it might have made sense to join one in the 70s. You cannot argue with the way in which technology has rendered geographical proximity irrelevant. Nobody would be doing this now. Nobody, starting from here, would invent the idea of an exclusive regional trade bloc. If we were not in the European Union now, the idea that any of the main parties would now be agitating to join is absurd. What we're up against is what Milton Friedman calls the tyranny of the status quo, of which more in a moment. But I really want to make for you a positive and cheerful case that takes account of the way in which the world has moved on. You heard Kate Hoey give those devastating figures. The year that we joined, 1973, you'll all be too young to remember it, 1973, the countries now in the European Union were 36% of the world economy. Today they're 17%, or at least they were 17% when Kate and I were looking it up earlier. They are plummeting by the second, so it's probably lower than that by the time that we actually reached the microphone this evening. 14 months in a row, our exports to the EU have fallen. 14 months in a row, our exports to the rest of the world have risen. Supporters of the EU are a little bit shifty on this point, because what they do, I've noticed Nick Clegg is a particular culprit here, they say roughly half our exports, or around half our exports, go to the EU. Well, that word around is a useful one for him. It has a flexibility, because if you actually look at what we mean by around half our exports, what we mean is that 10 years ago it was 55% and now it's 45%. And where's it going to be 10 years from now? Where's it going to be 20 years from now? How low does it have to go before we abandon the idea that all of our economic prospects are tied up with one dwindling part of the world? If the EU took 20% of our exports, would we still seriously be having a debate about merging our political institutions with those of the other member states in order to look after that little rump of our trade? Ladies and gentlemen, every continent on the planet is now growing except one. I made a jocular remark in one of these speeches recently. I said, every continent is growing except Antarctica and Europe. And I got a very, very cross email from a Spanish friend, and he went through a long list of statistics, and as I read through his list, I had to accept that his figures were right and mine were wrong. I'd got it completely the wrong way around, that actually Antarctica's doing fine. The cruise ships have returned, and the Antarctican economy is rebounding in line with everyone else's. We are trapped in the world's only shrinking trade bloc. The Eurozone's economy, to be correct, is the same size now that it was in 2008. Every other region on the planet has put that recession behind it. Only the Eurozone remains stagnant. And that, my friends, is no place for us to be. We don't sit on great natural resources in this damp, green, beautiful island home of ours. We have to make our way by what we buy and sell. And that means we have to be where the customers are. And with every month that passes, it becomes clearer that the customers are not in Europe. And yet, as long as we remain members of the European Union, we have no right to strike a bilateral free trade agreement with any non-EU state. And that's the fundamental economic argument against membership. Even now, even after more than 40 years of membership, I don't think this point has properly percolated down. I don't think people in Britain, for the most part, have processed it. We had two big visits recently from great national leaders, one from India and one from China. And in both cases, the BBC particularly, but the newspapers as well, wrote it up as a trade delegation. My friends, it's not a trade delegation if you can't sign a trade agreement. We can talk about all sorts of promotion and so on, but we can't do the one thing that would allow you to facilitate easier commercial access, which is to come to a bilateral agreement on reducing tariffs. Now, China last year grew at 6.6%. This year, with the great Chinese slowdown we've been hearing about, it's slowing all the way down to 6.1%. The Eurozone, if it grows at all, is going to grow at less than 1%. The figures are not yet in for 2015. The Eurozone, to repeat, is the same size it was in 2008. I would say that gives us a problem. The Swiss, they have complete access to the EU markets, absolutely full participants in the single market, the free movement of goods and services and so on, but they've signed a free trade agreement with China. Iceland, too. Absolute market access in Europe. They signed a free trade agreement in 2013, which came into effect last year with China, but we can't. And it's the same when it comes to India. Now, is there a country in this part of the world that stands to gain more from unhindered trade with India than ours? India is English-speaking, certainly for the purposes of business. It's common law. There are 1.4 million Brits of Indian origin. India is the third largest investor here. We are the third largest investor in India, but we cannot sign a free trade agreement with India. The European Union has been deferring those talks for 9 years, finally shelved them in 2014. Why? Because it doesn't suit the interests of French filmmakers and Italian textile workers and Polish farmers. We are dragged into a collective bargaining position that is far more protectionist than we would have chosen on our own. Now, back in the days when the European Union was 36% of the world economy, that might have had a certain logic. People might have said, okay, Commonwealth isn't going anywhere, maybe this is the trade-off that we have to make. But it bears no relation to the world as it is today. All the growth is taking place across the oceans, often in countries where this country has a particular advantage, being linked as it is by habit and history, by language and law, by commerce and kinship to every continent and archipelago. I was in India last month, and the two questions that came up most often were, why don't we have a free trade agreement? They couldn't believe that we didn't have the power to sign one bilaterally. One fellow jocularly said to me, it sounds like you're less independent now than we were before 1946. And I said, well, at least in the field of trade, that may be the case. And the other one, of course, and this equally applies and the two are linked, he said, why are Indian students no longer able to get to British universities? Well, the answer is, I think we all know, we've had to crack down on all non-EU visas in order to free up unlimited space for people from the EU who may have no connection to this country at all. It's 100 years ago that we were fighting the First World War. We came through that conflict because we had volunteers from every corner of the British Commonwealth and Empire, young men who were prepared to cross half the world in order to take up arms for a country on which in most cases they'd never set eyes, because they thought our values were worth defending. 1 million volunteers just from British India. And then in the Second World War, 2.5 million. The largest volunteer army in the history of conflict. There was no conscription in India. Every one of those men made a personal decision to enlist. And now, the families of those men find they can't bring auntie over for a wedding because we have so had to restrict our visa regime in order to free up unlimited space for people who may have been somewhere else during those two conflicts. That seems to me not just a question of basic fairness, but also a question of economic common sense. How have we got to the stage where we are slamming the door in the face of a qualified computer engineer from Bangalore in order to free up space for someone who may have no qualifications, may have a criminal record, but happens to come from Bialystok and therefore has an EU passport? To be clear, I'm not arguing, I don't think anyone is arguing for completely open-door Commonwealth immigration any more than we should have completely open-door EU immigration. All I'm saying is that it should be fair. We should not have institutionalized discrimination against our friends and allies on more distant continents. As I say, this is not a case just to do with nostalgia. On the contrary, this is about recognizing where the action is happening in the world, recognizing where the growth is taking place. I want to conjure for you the vision of an independent Britain 10 or 15 years from now. As the rump EU continues its genteel decline, think of this country as a world leader in law, in the audiovisual sector, in microtechnology, in manufacturing. Right? We often say, oh, we don't make anything in this country. It's just nonsense. It's just nonsense. We sell tea to China. We sell naan bread to India. We sell vodka to Poland. In fact, I made these points recently, and someone sent me an email and said, yes, and my company sells kayaks to the Inuit. And I looked at his website, and he did. You know, the idea that we don't make anything in this country is nonsense. We have a tremendous future if only we were able to tailor our policies to suit our own needs. I could see Hoxton being the Silicon Valley of software once we opt out of the EU's data retention rules. I could see our clinical trials once again being the most important world leaders once we opt out of the EU's regulations, which have taken us from being 12% of all global clinical trials to being 1%. I could see integrated Chinese cheap solar panels being part of every building and vehicle so that we barely notice them once we get rid of the EU protectionism that prevents us from importing them. There is a tremendous opportunity for us there as a global player. By all means, of course, engaged with the affairs of the continent, but not only of one continent. Raising our eyes to those more distant horizons, rediscovering that global vocation which our parents took for granted. Now you might say, well, couldn't we get that through an amicable renegotiation? Mightn't there be a way that we could get the best of both worlds? Like, couldn't we have a more flexible deal with the EU that would allow us to do these things that you're talking about while retaining our market links and our links of intergovernmental cooperation? Well, yes, absolutely, there is a way to do that. But it is now clear that that is not going to happen internally. It's clear that it's not going to happen as part of this Prime Minister's renegotiation package. In fact, it's pretty clear that we're not asking for any changes at all. I mean, never mind what I would have liked us to have been negotiating for. Look at what David Cameron himself was until very recently saying were absolute minimum requirements of a successful renegotiation. He was talking about taking back social and employment policy. He was talking about opting out of criminal justice policy, curbing the powers of the European Court, disapplying the Charter of Fundamental Rights, introducing a quota for the number of EU migrants annually. All of that talk has been dropped. As recently as the beginning of this year, ministers were talking about proper, full-on treaty change being the prerequisite for a successful renegotiation. That, again, has been completely abandoned. Now, at the risk of stating the obvious here, the test of whether the EU's rules have changed is whether they're actually changed, whether there is in fact a new treaty enshrining a new dispensation. No new treaty, no new deal. And we are therefore in the humiliating and degrading position of, in effect, banging the table and aggressively demanding the status quo. And threatening the terrors of the earth if we don't get it. In fact, it's very difficult to see how these negotiations could not be successful. What would the EU need to do for us not to be able to come back and say, we've won on all the points that we set out here? More competitiveness. This is seriously one of our four things. We want more competitive. You find me one Eurocrat, one politician from any of the member states at any point in the last 30 years who wouldn't have nodded along to the idea of more competitiveness, right? How would you define defeat on the issue of more competitiveness? Recognizing the status of the pound as a non-euro currency. We want it formally enshrined that there is more than one currency in the EU. Yeah. Why don't we formally enshrine that there's more than one language in the EU? How does stating the pretty bloody obvious amount to a concession? When you hear the leader of a major member state demanding these things, you know that nothing is being sought. If we have to talk in terms of a deal, it's been done. All that remains is to stage the row. We know that the row is coming because a pro-EU minister, Andrew Lansley, a very nice fellow, admitted in a talk to some Europhile lobbyists that this was the strategy. He said, we're going to lower expectations. Well, I have to say that bit's gone brilliantly. I can't fault him on the tactics there. So we're going to lower expectations, and then we're going to stage a bogus row, a sham fight, as they call it annually when they reenact the Battle of the Boyne in Northern Ireland. A sham fight. Well, we're having the sham fight now, right, about the benefits. But there's no engagement here. Right? There's nothing actually to argue about because there's no treaty changes to be negotiated. So it's not so much a fight as a haka of simulated aggression, intended to put on a dazzling display, but without any practical outcome. We know we're going to be facing the choice of remaining members of what the EU has become and what it is turning into, or rediscovering our independence, taking back our democracy. That's the choice. And as Suzanne said, they have one powerful argument on the other side. They know that they can't win on democracy. They know they can't win on globalization. They know they can't win on border controls. They know they can't win on the cost and all the money that we're sending every week. There's one thing that they've got going for them, which is change aversion. Right? Human beings are naturally conservative. And allied to risk aversion, which is part of our genome, is something else, which is the corpus of vested interests that grows up around whatever happens to be the status quo. The consultants and the contractors and the lobbyists who have all learnt how to make a very good living out of the EU. You can bet that they will form a large, well-funded and vocal part of the Remain In campaign. Those mega corporations, those big multinationals, those banks, who have spent years and millions lobbying Brussels to get rules that suit them and hurt their rivals, to raise barriers to entry, they are going to be taking the lead on the other side. And that is going to be a powerful argument. But ultimately, it's not a convincing argument. Not just because the interests of Goldman Sachs are not the same as the interests of the United Kingdom. It's an unconvincing argument because the status quo has implications both ways, right? If the EU is moving, if the EU is not a fixed settlement, but an evolving dynamic, then remaining in is not the same as staying where you are. It's remaining part of a journey. The way I could best describe it is like this. Imagine that you're sitting on a bus, okay? And the destination of the bus is very clear. At the front it says, in big letters, United States of Europe, right? Common army, common police force, common taxes. It's not as though the Eurocrats are being coy about mentioning these things, right? The driver keeps on shouting over his shoulder just to make sure you've got the message. We are going to have a common minimum wage, and we're going to have more fiscal harmonization, and we're going to have more sovereignty in Brussels, right? Now, if you don't want to go to that destination, if you want the status quo on that bus, do you literally remain immobile in your seat? Or do you take a couple of steps to get off the bus and then bid it well on its journey to that destination? By all means, let our friends, if that's the choice they make, go ahead and create some kind of quasi-federal union with its own currency and its own parliament and its own president and its own foreign policy and all the other things they want. We'll be cheering them on. They'll be able to rely on our support like a buttress on a medieval cathedral from the outside. They'll always have our goodwill, our military alliance, our open markets, but we will not bargain with our democracy. We will not compromise our independence. And ultimately, it's the democracy that this keeps coming back to. The right to hire and fire the people who pass our laws. Something we fought a civil war to establish in this country. If we remain part of what the European Union is turning into, we will see a continuation of the transfer of power from elected representatives who are answerable to the rest of us to unelected Eurocrats who are invulnerable to public opinion. That isn't some scary story about what might happen in the future. It is an obvious observation about what is happening now. You'll sometimes hear it said the European Commission is undemocratic in the sense that its members are not elected. But you know what? It's worse than that. It's actually anti-democratic in the sense that you generally have to have lost an election before you become a European Commissioner. It's only when, like Neil Kinnock or Chris Patton or now Jean-Claude Juncker, it's only when you've been expressly rejected by your voters that you are invited to come and legislate for them anyway. Unsurprisingly, the European Commission therefore has a fairly jaundiced view of democracy. In the run-up to the recent Greek election, Jean-Claude Juncker put it with pitiless clarity. He said, there can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. There can be no democratic choice against the European treaties. The German finance minister, Mr. Schäuble, put it even more pithily. He said, elections change nothing. That should be kind of written above the European commissioners, their motto. Elections change nothing. It's true. Cast your minds back to 2011, when in 2 EU member states we witnessed, in effect, Brussels-backed civilian coups. In Italy and in Greece, elected prime ministers were toppled and replaced by Eurocrats. Respectively, Mario Monti in Italy, the former vice president of the European Commission, and Lucas Papademos in Greece, the former vice president of the European Central Bank. They headed what were called national governments. But these governments were put together for the sole purpose of driving through policies that the nation had just rejected. Thus we saw the apotheosis of the European project. Apparatchiks in Brussels, governing through apparatchiks in Rome and Athens, the people and their elected representatives cut out altogether. Now, my friends, pointing those things out doesn't make you anti-Europe. I speak French, I speak Spanish, I've lived and worked all over the continent. My objection to the EU is not to the idea of a bunch of countries coming together and doing collectively what they can't achieve singly and arbitrating their disputes in common. You'd have to be insane to be against that. I'm not aware of anyone in the Vote Leave operation who has a problem with collaboration with our friends and allies across the Channel. Such a person may exist somewhere in Britain, but I've yet to meet him or her. The argument is about democracy. It's about whether decisions are made by the representatives of the people who are affected by those decisions. It's about whether, having struggled for centuries to replace extractive, oligarchic, tyrannical regimes with open representative government that has to answer to everybody else, we're prepared to toss that aside in the name of Europe. I'm not. I spoke about the role of this part of the world in the run-up to D-Day. Our fathers, mine among them, were prepared in the last analysis to defend with force of arms our right to live under our own laws and our own people in our own sovereign parliament. It's not something to be tossed aside lightly without a shot being fired in anger. Can't we achieve more as a country than just to be a subunit of a country called Europe? Have we completely forgotten the global vocation that once pulled us across the oceans? My friends, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. On course, by the way, to overtake Germany by 2030. There's a cheerful thought. We have the 4th largest military budget on the planet. We're one of 5 permanent seat holders on the UN Security Council. We're one of the group of 20, one of the group of 8. Leading member of the Commonwealth. Our language is the most widely spoken by the human race. We have the best universities in Europe, some of the best in the world. How much bigger do we have to be before we're able to run our own affairs in our own interests, collaborating with our friends, but governing ourselves? My friends, we can do better.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.